Sir James Frazer's Golden Bough. This has been a terribly influential book, and it's something that on first reading you may not understand why it is that we're doing this, or why it is that we're starting with it. Asking the question, why should we start with a 19th century or early 20th century piece of comparative mythology, anthropology of religion? That's a very reasonable question to ask. It's not immediately obvious why it is that this kind of work should still be relevant, especially after you dive into it and you see some of the things that he says. What I want to put to you, though, is the Golden Bough is still read frequently in university studies, and the reason for this is not because of the individual theses that he forwards in the text. Frazer has a number of really kind of dated things to say when it comes to his conception of the progression from magic to religion to science. He sees this in a very linear fashion, in a rather, one might say, reductive fashion, in counting out religion, seeing it as a precursor to science, counting out magic, seeing that as a kind of, as he would say, rude and primitive practice that accords with an early stage of human civilization, but certainly not with us now, He has a number of value judgments in there that certainly if this were written in the 21st century, you wouldn't see. But all that aside, the work is terribly influential and is still worth reading, not because of these theses, but because of the way that he chronicles the stories. And this is of particular interest to me. My background in philosophy and my interest in philosophy is in rhetoric. And so the impact of the way that something is structured, the way that something is said, over and above the content, when that happens, it's something special. And there's something interesting going on. And certainly with Frazer's work, I think we can argue that there's something very interesting going on, because the work has an impact. There is a certain effect that is achieved by his chronicling of a number of different stories. And so when you hear about the corn goddesses of various places, the rice goddesses of various places, when you hear about the different rain dances, fertility rituals, the different man gods, so those who are either both man and God or somehow, and he sees this as presaging Christ in a certain form, of course, and as he also sees Christ as simply one more instance of the same sort of thing. So there's a great tendency to want to compare and to be willing to compare in his work. Now, listing out all of these things and giving us a large number of very similar stories taken from different points in history, different points in geography, and otherwise dissimilar cultures, he's able to suggest to us, via a kind of induction really, that there is something going on, that there is a similarity there, that he doesn't have to point to individual structural features necessarily to say that, okay, this is similar because it's still a goddess in these situations and because the ritual still shows a sacrifice at this time. He doesn't have to do that kind of thing. And this is, I think, what's most interesting about it, and this is what makes it worthy of rhetorical study, and certainly, I think, worthy of us still reading. By simply juxtaposing a number of these stories together and putting them side by side and saying, okay, just look at all of the different stories that appear to be saying the same thing, it makes it very apparent to us. It makes it very obvious to us that, okay, there must be something going on here. There must be something that is worthy of comparison, and that we are justified in some way of saying that these stories have something in common. And that's what's really powerful about this, because we're seeing it across time and across geographical regions where it's very difficult to argue for diffusion. The idea of diffusion is where you have one idea. So let's say I figure out how to spice and bread fried chicken. I have a particularly good recipe for fried chicken. If I pass that on to my children and my friends, and then they pass it on because it's good and people like it, that's diffusion. So the idea is spreading across people by word of mouth, by learning, and particularly by learning from another person and learning by seeing. So in other words, it's a very obvious and easy to trace and easy to understand kind of influence. When I say that it's difficult to maintain that diffusion is what's going on here, what I mean is a lot of the peoples that he's studying and that he takes these myths from don't really have any contact with one another. They're spread over thousands of miles in these otherwise very traditional, technologically simple societies that don't have any means of communicating with one another. It's very difficult to think of that much commonality being explainable simply by way of a diffusion of ideas. And this is, I think, and we'll see as we go forward in the course, especially much later in the course, by the time we get to the 20th century and start talking about some of the work that was done with Carl Jung and others, this becomes even more difficult to maintain as a thesis when we look at creation of mythology, because it's possible for us to observe the creation of new myths, new rituals, and stories and the like in certain tribes. Certainly it is easier to observe that kind of thing there than it is to look to our own society. We have special barriers in place to prevent the creation of new prophecy and religion and that sort of thing. And this is really a relatively recent occurrence, something only in the past not even 2,000 years. Because the last books of the Christian Bible are not even 2,000 years old yet. Nevertheless, that's going to be one of the things to think about when you're looking at Frazer, when you're reading all of these stories. Does it make sense to think that these ideas may have simply spread from one place to another? Or are we forced to think there's got to be another explanation? Is there something common in human psychology? Is there something that we're just naturally inclined to tell the same kinds of stories? And if so, why? What do we get out of them? Why do we keep them around? All of these questions are going to be very relevant and things that I want you to keep in mind as you're trying to understand why it is that Frazer's juxtaposition of stories is impactful, because I think it's fairly clear that it is, that it does have an impact on its readers. It's shocking. It has been shocking ever since it was written a century ago. And that alone should signal to us that there's something interesting going on and worthy of study.